So, watched the recent Soho Forum debate on nationalism, and put it blunt, I wasn't particularly happy with the results. Um, I thought in the affirmative, Richard Lowry had essentially bad rhetoric and a couple of good points. And unfortunately, it's bad rhetoric that was aimed at at an audience that was not ready for his particular form. And in the negative, Alex, he had phenomenal rhetoric, but most of it wasn't really based in logic. Uh, his constant reference to very narrow definitions of terms and essentially relegating all nationalism down to a comparison of German socialism under Hitler was kind of cartoonish. I mean, yeah, he beat the guy in the debate. He beat him in the rhetoric department, but I really don't think he established good, solid logical arguments. So before I pick apart some of the things I saw in the debate, I want to give you my take on nationalism so you see where my biases is. I am actually a fence sitter on this. I am a libertarian, uh, but I have a hard time seeing how uh, a governmentless system or a very minimalist government system functions, protects people's rights, and does so with the existence of other nation states in the world. Uh, my mental example would be the many German states that existed in Europe for the longest time. I believe some upwards to 450 different little minor German states between Prussia and France. And although in some cases they had a decent amount of freedom depending on the local government, they had a problem of constantly being the playthings of much bigger powers. And that's my issue where I wonder if a nation state on some level is necessary to make this work. And I look back to the early United States, uh, in some cases, how it looked under the Articles of Confederation, and how it looked, at least in the earliest part of the Republic. And one would have to say that nationalism in a nation state did seem to be working. I mean, the benefits of living in that society were very clear, and I think almost anybody would be willing to accept the terms of that system. So the idea of just poo-pooing nationalism as being antiquated and somehow uh, an anarchical or minarchical society is capable and could spring up, we don't have really much in the way of evidence of it. What evidence for such societies exist are very isolated or groups, some of the Viking colonies and such. So let's get into some of the definitions that we have problems with here. Okay, the first problem is I believe Alex was being, and Richard's at fault for letting Alex get away with this, but he was basically taking very narrow definitions of things and running with them and using it as kind of a weapon throughout. So let's look at the word nation. I'm getting this from the online etymology dictionary. Nation, 1300, nation, a race of people, large group of people with a common ancestry and language from Old French, nation, birth, rank, descendants, relatives, country, homeland, and directly from the Latin, and pardon my Latin because I'm not good at it, nationem, nominative of natio, birth, origin, breed, stock, kind, species, race of people, tribe. Literally that which has been born, from natus, past participle of nasi, to be born, root, give birth, beget, with derivatives referring to procreation in familial and tribal groups. The word in English, used in a broad sense, a race of people, an aggregation of persons of the same ethnic family and speaking the same language, and in a narrower sense, a political society composed of government and subjects or citizens and constituting a political unit, an organized community inhabiting a defined territory within which a sovereignty is exercised. Okay, so the problem was we had Alex was taking a very narrow definition of nation, and essentially his definition actually does not fit what really happened in Roman society, where the Latin is taken from, because he was taking the most narrowest form of the original Latin, basically a member of our tribe or ethnicity. And I'll talk to that in a moment, why essentially his take wasn't working. And then the other definition that he was essentially beating uh, Richard about the head with was the concept of nation state. And he was insisting that the United States, in its original inception from the Constitution, was not a nation state. Okay, so I'm pulling this definition from Encyclopedia Britannica. Uh, Nation state, a territorially bounded sovereign polity, a state that is ruled in the name of a community of citizens who identify themselves as a nation. Legitimacy of a nation state's rule over a territory and over the population inhabiting it stems from a right of a core national group within the state, which may include all or only some of its citizens, to self-determination. Members of the core national group see the state as belonging to them and consider the approximate territory of the state to be their homeland. Accordingly, they demand that other groups, both within and outside the state, recognize and respect their control over the state. As a political model, the nation state fuses two principles: the principle of state sovereignty, first articulated in the Peace of Westphalia, which recognizes the right of states to govern their territories without external interference, and the principle of national sovereignty, which recognizes the right of national communities to govern themselves. So, this idea that only nation states existed in Europe and Europeans were the only ones who understood what a nation state was, and the United States was not a nation state, sounds kind of silly when put up against the actual definition of it. And so let's talk a little bit about the Romans. The Roman and their empire. So, because we were talking, Alex was very adamant that the Romans had this incredibly narrow-minded idea of nation, and that the French very deliberately took their term of nationalism from the Latin root, fully understanding the intent what the Romans had. So how essentially ethnocentric, well, maybe not the best term, but let's say how insular was the Roman Empire. Well, yes, the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic before it, in conquest, took lots of slaves back to the homeland, but these slaves could buy their way out of slavery. Now, some of them may not be able to within their lifetime, but many did. Uh, and also, the children of auxiliaries could become citizens. So essentially, the army would hire on non-citizen soldiers from other nationalities that were within the empire and some from without, and they would function as what were called auxiliaries. If an auxiliary served for 20 years, their children were automatically citizens. This isn't particularly this is expansive. The Romans didn't just think of, we are people from the specific spot, and we are Romans, and we are the only ones who can ever be a Roman. The idea of Roman citizenship expanded over time. Now, mind you, much narrower when it started, but if I can be aware of the expansiveness of the term of nation, a national, and nationalism, and who could be part of it. If I am aware of this, clearly French revolutionaries could be just as aware of this. So his argument that Alex's argument that somehow the French were well aware of some very narrow view of what nationalism was based on the Latin root doesn't take into context how the Romans actually applied who could be part of the nation. Okay, so I thought Richard brought up a really good point where he talked about the difference between when the British Isles were a bunch of different kingdoms that were essentially at constant war with each other versus when it became a single entity, which essentially the whole island was either part of a single nation or at least a multi-nation conglomerate that acted as a nation. Now, you can make a lot of comments and arguments against some of the bad things the British Empire did, but in general, we can say that for at least its own citizens, they dramatically improved the prosperity, expanded and protected the rights of its citizens, and was generally a peaceful, safe place to live. You wouldn't say the same thing about the British Isles when it was broke up into a half dozen different warring kingdoms. So something to be said that nationalism, in some cases at least, improves the conditions of the citizenry. So when we end up talking about the French Revolution and nationalism, one of the things, and really most people kind of recognize that nationalism was kind of birthed in the French Revolution. And we have a tendency to look at the area of France and say everybody in there is French. But at the time leading into the French Revolution, there were definite, distinct ethnicities within France that looked at themselves in terms of their ethnicity rather than being French in general. So with the advent of the French Revolution, one of the big things that occurred was the entire civilized world declared war on France. So France was not at the point going, we're just for no good reason at all going to come up with this idea of nationalism and become an expansionist monster. Not remotely what happened. Nationalism was an evolutionary response survival of that particular state. The revolutionary state of France would have been wiped off the face of the planet if it weren't for nationalism. So the idea of getting everybody, all these different ethnic groups within the country, to identify as French solidified the people and led to a more effective defense of the country. It created a fervor that sent men going to the front lines with pikes in the age of gunpowder and muskets. The French Republic would eventually have some expansionistic views, but in all honesty, their initial attempts were to try to spread their revolution beyond their borders. So not as much as conquest as it was ideologically driven. The only excesses you can really, say only. There are obviously, as the revolution progressed, there were a lot of excesses, but the initial excesses were anti-religious in nature. French Revolution, because of the strong ties of the Catholic Church to the state, the revolutionaries decided that the Catholics were a problem as well. And they didn't just go merely anti-Catholic, they went anti-religious. So certain groups in the country who were not willing to toe the line with anti-religious views did become targeted, but they weren't targeted because of ethnicity. They weren't targeted for how recently they came to the nation or anything else that Alex would suggest happens in all nationalist systems. Now, interestingly enough, we have Napoleon taking over at a certain point, and really, it wasn't the nationalist French craving an empire as much as it was grasping at straws for stability, which Napoleon did bring a form of stability that was much greater than what the revolutionary government was capable of doing. And one of the interesting things of Napoleon's conquests were uh, he had a tendency to create new nations as he went along. Now, in some cases, he was supplanting the existing aristocracy in some of the countries and replacing it with relatives and cronies. But for the most part, he was respecting the existence of nations that had been essentially repressed for a long time. Uh, Part of the processes of the Napoleonic period, the area between Germany and Prussia, which was made up of some 450 different German states, were reduced to a number well under 100 by the time the Napoleonic Wars were done. Uh, certain nations were allowed to consolidate that essentially had been wanting to consolidate for a long time. He gave voice to the Polish, who had been completely subjugated under the Austrians and the Austrians, Russians, and Prussians, and he reestablished a Polish state, giving voice to a people. Now, I can't speak to how exactly that Polish state government worked, but I would say for the enthusiasm the Poles had for assisting the French in their endeavors, I would say the Poles felt better under their Polish system than they did an international group of occupiers. One of the ladies in the audience started to bring up a really good point, and unfortunately, it seemed like both Richard and Alex missed it. She was mentioning the Austrian Empire, or which would eventually become Austria-Hungary. Now, this is a very interesting thing to look at in terms of nationalism. The Austrian Empire and eventually Austria-Hungary, you had a region that was made up of 10 major languages. The most dominant language being German, only spoken by 23% of the population. The way the Austrian Empire was able to prevent itself from disintegrating was implementing a form of nationalism. What they did was they formed what was called a dual monarchy, where essentially Austria and Hungary both got to form their own governments. They each had a sovereign, they each had a parliament, and then essentially they had kind of a super parliament that kind of worked out the differences between the two. It almost worked like the Senate and the House of Representatives, and then the reconciliation bills they would do. Interestingly, when things were starting to become unstable with the various Slavic groups to the south in what would become eventually future Yugoslavia, the Balkan region. One of the things that's not well understood was that the Archduke Ferdinand, the gentleman who was assassinated, one of the things he was working on was he was a reformer. And what he was working on was creating a triple monarchy. And they wanted to raise a third king in the same idea of the Austrian side, the Hungarian side, and they wanted to create a Slavic king in order to give the Slavic people of the empire their own voice, their own government, and they would become a triple monarchy. And one of the reasons he was assassinated was to prevent this from happening, because the Serbians feared that if they had some form of representation in the government, revolutionary fervor would die and their attempts to create their own little nation would fail. So we got the big bugaboo. We got uh, the German socialist government under Hitler. And this was the area where I thought Alex really was off base. I mean, rhetorically brilliant, yeah. I mean, if you can say, hey, your idea and Nazis are one and the same, and your opponent isn't smart enough to pick it apart, uh, yeah, you've done well there. But in terms of logic, it's dopey. Because that's literally not how things worked at all. So the thing that makes Germany much, much different than any other nationality is that we're going back to the pre-French Revolutionary time. We had the country of Austria, which was the Austrian Empire, which was only a partially German empire. We had Prussia, which was much, much further to the east than Germany. Now, in fact, at their when they'd expanded as far as they could to the west, Berlin was actually on their western frontier. And then between Prussia, Austria, and France were 450 different little German states. And for the longest time, all these countries were a plaything for the other groups. And this idea of a German identity started coming up, saying, "Hey, if we're all speaking some form of German here. We all have very similar cultures. We have a strong history together. Why aren't we one and the same?" So when Napoleon started the process of reducing 450 little countries into some 50 little countries, it basically created the idea in people's head that, well, if all these little countries can be merged to make these other countries and we all seem to get along together, why can't all of us get together and be one? And really weird stuff happened, and I can't get into it in detail, but I invite you to go out and read up on it. Some of my earlier videos talk a little bit about this, and that is the German Volk concept. And essentially, they came up with almost this mythological, almost supernatural idea of who the German people were, the Volk, and how they all needed to be united together, and this idea of that the Volk actually was beyond borders. So it was oddly not nationalistic. It was not a nationalism as much as it was the idea of all these different people who speak the same language and have a similar culture should be together as a single nation. So when we get to the point where the German socialist government under Hitler comes into power, our ideas of nationalism get turned on their head. So if you look at American nationalism or British nationalism or French nationalism, for the most part, they drew their borders around their area and said, okay, everybody inside here If you're speaking the same language and you generally agree with our customs and ideas, you're all one of us. What the German socialist government under Hitler did was turn this concept completely on its head. Okay? They turned on their own citizens for not resisting, but for existing. They picked wide groups of people who had been there for generations. Jewish people were moving into the German sphere as early as the early 1600s. So they're taking people who had been there for generations, people who had fought in the last war, and said, okay, just because of this new idea we came up with, you're no longer part of the nation. Well, this completely doesn't fit all the other uh, blueprints for nationalism. So it's an outlier, it's an abnormality. And then the other weird thing it did is it said, okay, all these people who are outside our borders, if they speak German, if they have a German last name, if they can tie some ethnicity back to some particular German area, we're going to consider them either citizens or at least citizens with lesser standing within our group. And these are people who'd lived outside Germany again for multiple generations. You had people in Russia, Germans who had settled there under Catherine the Great, who the Germans are saying, "Yeah, you're our citizens." Does this sound like any other form of nationalism that was out there? It doesn't. And so the German socialist government under Hitler is clearly the most abnormal of all of them. So let's get to talking about the U.S. as a nation state and then being nationalist. One of the things to fully understand was that the purveyors of the U.S. Constitution, the Federalists, were nationalists. They admitted themselves as being nationalists. Their goal was to do as much as they possibly could to take as much of the sovereignty as they could possibly get away with taking away from the existing states, which were essentially their own little nations, nation states, their own little nations, and see if they could put it into a central government. This is nationalism. This was the creation of a new nation state. Whatever Alex was trying to say in terms of trying to claim that the initial constitutional republic was not a nation state, I'm sorry, he had no valid argument there that I could hear. So the interesting part is the most radical expansionists in the United States at that time were actually some of the anti-federalists who, once the French Revolution broke out, saw it as an extension of our revolution and thought we should be involved in spreading this revolution that we had around the world and take out the monarchies. Now, ultimately, we stayed out of that mess as much as we could. And you could say, and I'll tell you, just keep it in perspective, I very much am a fan of the Articles of Confederation. I'm also very much, I would like to think that if I were alive at that time, I would have been an anti-federalist. But that doesn't mean I have to fail to recognize what the nationalists achieved. The nationalists achieved a nation at more or less peace, at least peaceful for the overwhelming majority of the population, a massive respect for rights that not only mimicked what England had been able to do for its citizens, but actually expanded them. And it also, while doing both of these, expanded prosperity. Now, there's not too many groups of nationalists out there who have succeeded in creating a nation that's prosperous, uh, essentially recognizing rights and pretty safe to live at the same time. You don't see them coming together because usually the argument is you have to give up. You have to give up uh, your freedoms for safety, and in this case, they got all of it. So I think the really main problem we have here is we had on one side, uh, Richard was attempting to go, well, yeah, here's nationalism, and I know it has some bad connotations, and I really wish I could just use a completely different word altogether, but I'm going to let myself be tarred with socialist Germany under Hitler, and I'm not going to fight it off effectively. Uh, at the same time, that's essentially what Alex did, just saying, well, yeah, here's a group of nationalists. They were the socialist government under Hitler. They're one and the same. And no one effectively argued their way out of it. So here's my take to argue out of that. So if we're to talk about capitalism, and I'm just using this as an example to get to my point. So if I said, well, capitalism, it doesn't seem to work very well, does it? Look at the United States. We're a capitalist country. Capitalism doesn't work. Well, I'm sure most of the people who would be listening to this would say, well, no. There's more than one type of capitalism. Okay, I grabbed a list here off of Wikipedia, and some of these forms of capitalism may be totally BS. I'm not saying I believe all of these exist, but some of them clearly do. We have anarcho-capitalism, community capitalism, humanistic capitalism, neo-capitalism, state monopoly capitalism, techno-capitalism. So if capitalism can exist under different hyphenated forms, which I think most people would agree it does, because most of us would agree that we would like free market capitalism. There is a form of capitalism going on in the United States at this time that clearly isn't free market, so there must be different types of capitalism. Thus, I am saying there are different kinds of nationalism. There isn't only one kind. And we can see that they existed throughout history. Let me give you some of the examples. So I would call the type of nationalism the United States started out with at the inception of its Constitution, Republican nationalism. We had a republic, and people were chauvinistic about their republic. They loved their republic, they loved their laws, they loved their freedoms. They understood to a certain extent the documents that set up their government. And for the most part, it was peaceful. It wasn't out seeking wars. So, if there's a Republican nationalism, well, why can't there be a socialist nationalism? Now, you're like thinking, oh, you're talking about Germany. No, actually, socialist nationalism is what we call fascism under Italy. It was a socialist government that predicated everything based on who was within the borders of the country. For instance, in fascist Italy, until the Germans started forcing the issue, uh, Jews had no problem living there. In fact, they were prominent within the fascist party. There wasn't a big issue. Now, another form of nationalism I would call racial nationalism. Now, this is the German socialist government under Hitler. They didn't merely respect the lines around their country as a nation. Certain people within those lines were immediately excluded, and they had no ability to redeem themselves. And there were people outside those borders who were also considered automatically part of things, even if they hadn't been involved in anything German for generations. Now, they started talking a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson and other folks along those lines. This is what I call progressive nationalism. And this is essentially where the Republican nationalism of the early nation was hijacked, where this idea came up with, well, not only are we great, and this nation is a fantastic place, this idea needs to be exported all around the world, using whatever force is necessary to make it happen. And I would say to this day, we are still functioning under progressive nationalism, where there's an attempt to export the American system worldwide. But that's obviously under siege right now because there is a globalist agenda fighting against that progressive nationalism. But in terms of how nationalism is viewed in the country, I think progressive nationalism is still what holds the greatest sway. So that's my take on it. In the comment section below, what do you think? Do you think it's fair to hyphenate nationalisms into different groups, as I did? Do you think Alex actually made good logical points, or do you think he did a great job talking his way out of this position? And clearly, I thought, Richard, and I don't want to sound like I'm being very dismissive of him. Obviously, a really smart guy. I think his what he wants to achieve is probably for the good, but I don't think he really understood his audience well, and I don't think he was expecting arguments that he was going to be coming up against, and he didn't really prepare for them. It'd be interesting to see a rematch between these guys and see if Richard could dig himself out on a second run of it. So what do you think? How do you think Richard did versus Alex? What's your opinions on that? And then in general, what about nationalism? Can libertarian ideals function under a Republican nationalism? Please smash the like button. If you know somebody who might find this topic interesting, please share it with them. And if you stumbled across my channel via the YouTube algorithm, please consider subscribing to my channel and check out all the other videos I've done. Well, thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.